So we're going to talk about what exactly is anxiety, how it impacts us, and then we'll talk about some things you can do before, during, and after the test. And then we'll talk a little bit about some strategies that you can use during the test if you're in that moment where your mind is going blank and you have no idea what you're doing. Okay? I have it's a start of what exactly is anxiety with a bit of a definition. And in a sense, we don't really need that because we've all experienced it, right? So you know what it feels like to be anxious, whether it's your heart is racing because you're really excited about something, or you're getting really sweaty and your mouth is getting dry if you have to do public speaking, for example. So it's just any time when we have to face a challenge and we may have to perform or exhibit somehow what we know, that can be extremely stressful. Now, there's a particular form of anxiety called test anxiety, and of course, as you would know, that relates specifically to when we're faced with a testing situation, whether it's through school, which is most of where our testing happens, or, for example, if you're going for your driver's license or some other form of test. And it happens before a test, and it can happen during a test. And so before a test, that's referred to as anticipatory anxiety, where you're aware that something's about to come and you're feeling really anxious about it. And then there's the anxiety that's situational, that's when you're in the test. And much like you were saying, Megan, it's when you're in the moment and you're starting to feel panicky, and maybe that's when your mind goes blank, because you're starting to really think about the stress of the situation as opposed to all that you know about the topic. So you can see down at the bottom on the left-hand side, there's a chart that kind of shows where anxiety peaks. And that's exactly how it looks, that anxiety typically builds. And I like to think of it like a snowman. Now, have you all built a snowman at some point in your life? So anxiety is much like that, where you start sort of in the corner of the yard, you've got a little snowball and you're rolling it around, right? And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's exactly what anxiety is like, is it typically starts with something really small, usually just a little thought. And we pay attention to it, and it gets bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden it's this mammoth thing that just impedes our ability to actually show what we know on a test. So what causes test anxiety? The biggest reason that people feel anxiety during tests is lack of preparation. And so one of the big things you can do to combat test anxiety is to prepare more. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Another reason that people feel test anxiety is if they've had an experience in the past that maybe was negative on a test. So, for example, if you've had a test in the past where you've felt really anxious and maybe had your mind go blank during the test, that makes it more likely that it'll happen in the future. And so you start to worry about, well, what if this happens to me again? And feeling really anxious about that. Another reason for test anxiety is if we're focusing too much on the outcome of the test. So it might be that you've put the pressure on yourself, that you want to get this particular grade, maybe to get a scholarship or to just show that you've received a particular grade. And when we focus too much on that, that can cause us a lot of anxiety to reach a particular grade point. Focusing too much on what other people think. So maybe you're in a group of friends that's really competitive, and maybe someone in the group is, really strong academically, and you feel like you have to compete with them somehow. And so, after the test, if they're like, oh, hey, how did it go? What did you get? I got 90, right? And sort of feeling as though you need to compete with them somehow. And finally, issues that happen outside of school can make us feel anxious. So it might have absolutely nothing to do with the exam itself, but just the anxiety that we might have from our life that is spilling over into what's happening during the exam, right? Those are all reasons that we can be feeling really anxious during a test. So let's look at the ways that it can actually impact us. So anxiety can affect us physiologically, behaviorally, and psychologically. So physiologically, these are the symptoms you're probably familiar with. So your heart is racing, maybe your mouth is getting really dry, getting sweaty, feeling like maybe it's harder to breathe, to catch your breath. You might have to go to the bathroom a lot. that can be a real sign of anxiety. Another thing that we may not necessarily associate with being anxious is yawning. And the reason we might actually yawn a lot when we're feeling anxious is because typically when we're feeling anxious, we don't take in really good deep breaths. And so your body will actually prompt you to yawn, because when you yawn, you actually take in a nice deep breath. So if you notice that you're yawning a lot, but you're not actually tired, that could be a sign as well that you're feeling kind of anxious. Behaviorally, one of the big things that people will notice when they're feeling anxious is being indecisive. So a friend might say, oh, hey, let's go for dinner. What do you want to eat? And you're just sort of overcome with the decision, and it feels like it's too much to decide. Or a friend, might ask you about the test itself, and is this chapter on the test? And you start to think, I don't know, I can't remember, right? And get kind of panicky because of it. Difficulty organizing our thoughts is also common when we're feeling really anxious about an exam. So almost feeling as though we've got all these different thoughts happening and we can't kind of stream them together and have them make sense. And psychologically, the way we can react to anxiety is feeling really upset, feeling apprehensive or uneasy, and having a lot of really negative thoughts about ourselves, maybe about our ability to do the exam, or what the outcomes of the test are going to be. So do all of those sound like things you've experienced in the past? You're familiar with them, hey? Yeah. So let's now talk about what are some things you can do to prepare for an exam that can help you manage the anxiety. And there's some things that you can do well in advance of the test. And part of those are just information gathering. So finding out from your instructor what's on the test. For example, is it just a couple of chapters, or is it the entire term's worth of information? Where is the exam itself? Is it in the same classroom, or does it need to be moved for some reason? And then spending a lot of time doing review. Now, for those of you that have attended the study skills workshop, you know that I've talked to you about the really big keys of studying being broken down into 3 different things. So doing that daily review, the weekly review, and then the more structured study time closer to exams, right? So if you've done all of those little bits of reviewing consistently over the term, when it gets time for exams, anxiety should actually be pretty low, right? Because you should have a really good grasp on it. So again, the daily review is just looking over the lecture notes from that one particular day, and that's just a small chunk of time. And the weekly review is where you're looking over the lecture notes from the entire past week. And then about 2 or 3 weeks before an exam is when you actually start your studying. So given that we're about 2 weeks from the end of the semester, you should already be doing some studying for final exams, right? So just smaller bits of time over the next 2 or 3 weeks should bring you to a place where you're feeling a lot more prepared for the exam itself. So I would encourage you at this point of year to set up a study schedule where you are looking at all that you have to do in a week and setting aside time to do some of that more structured study time. So depending on your course, it could be that you're looking back from September, if it's a cumulative final exam, or it might be that you're just looking back to the last midterm, right? So knowing what the expectation is for your class. Another thing you can do is actually test yourself. So if you're in a study group, for example, what you could do is everyone come up with 4 or 5 questions that you could potentially be on the test, and then share them amongst the study group so that everybody can kind of share from that wealth of test questions. Or think about if you were the instructor and you had to write the exam for this course, what things do you think are important? And start to ask yourself those kinds of questions. Now, some of your textbooks probably come with a study guide. So really take advantage of those questions, work through those questions. Or if there's questions that are at the end of each chapter, test yourself on those, right? So really just kind of practicing with those tests. Some instructors will also have old tests on file, on reserve in the library. So check through those and practice working through those test questions as well. Okay? Any questions or comments so far? Okay. So we talked about the importance of gathering all the information you can up about the test, about setting up a study schedule, reviewing consistently and effectively throughout the semester, and testing yourself. And another way that you can test yourself is through flashcards. And those are really a quick, easy way that you can be studying almost anywhere, right? So if you're on the bus, or if you just have, say, 10 minutes between class as a break, or if you're maybe taking a break from studying something else and you just kind of quickly look through the flashcards. They're a nice, easy way to test yourself on the information. So with the flashcards, on one side you could have just a brief question or a content area, and on the back side a more detailed answer. And so you can do that to yourself, or you can maybe pass them on to a family member or a friend and have them probe you for some of those questions. So that's a good way to do it. As well, having to teach something to someone else is probably one of the best ways ever to learn something. So when you've learned something new, try to share it with someone else. So you might go home after your earth science class and say to your roommate or to your parent that, oh, this is what I've learned today, and let me explain to you how this works. Because in having to explain it, you're putting it into your own words and really ensuring that you're understanding it as opposed to just memorizing it, right? How can you actually start to change your attitude before the exam? Because we talked about when you're feeling anxious, one of the big things that happens is that your thinking is pretty negative. So it's important that you really are focusing on thinking a lot more positively and helpfully when you're feeling that anxiety before a test. So for example, let me give you two scenarios. The first is Holly. She's got a test on Friday and she's thinking about it right now, and she's thinking, I'm in trouble. I'm not very good at math and I really don't understand the concepts. I don't think I'm going to do very well, which probably means I'm going to lose my scholarship, which means I might have to drop out of school, which means I probably will never amount to anything in this world. And so she's feeling really, really anxious, right? That is such a negative scenario. Now, on the other hand, let's say Holly's thinking, okay, so math is a bit of a challenge for me, but I've actually been studying very consistently throughout this semester. I've been doing my daily review and my weekly review, and I've got a good study schedule set up. I've gone to see my instructor for some extra help. I'm getting together with my study group. I'm going to be just fine. I'm a strong student. I'm really capable. I know I can do this. What a difference, right, between the two scenarios. So keeping in mind that how you talk to yourself is super important in preparing for an exam. So talking to yourself a lot more friendly and helpful, much like you would talk to a friend who was sharing with you that they were feeling stressed or anxious, right? Kind of that same sort of voice that you would share with a friend is how you need to speak to yourself. If there are things that are happening in your life that are distracting you or causing anxiety that you need to maybe just sort of put to the side for now, one way you can do that is just make some notes. So jot things down on a piece of paper as a reminder that I'm going to come back and I'll stress about this later, but not right now. And it's referred to as sort of packaging your anxiety and saving it for a time of day that's more suitable. Because then you can say to yourself, like, okay, I know I'm going to worry about that later, but I don't have the time to do it right now. Another thing that's really important in dealing with anxiety are relaxation strategies. So if you're feeling anxious, we typically notice it in our bodies, right? So you might get like a sore back or a stiff neck, headaches. All of that can be really symptomatic of anxiety. So it's important that you do things with your body to manage the anxiety. And a great way to do that is exercise. And if you're on a sports team or if you have a recreational activity that you like to do, it's really important that during the upcoming exam time that you're consistently doing those sorts of activities to help manage a lot of that anxiety. Even things like listening to music that you find really energizing and refreshing or soothing. If you like to do stretching, right, and just sort of stretch out those muscles. And I'm going to have you do a couple of relaxation activities that are really, really helpful to do. And relaxation is much like other things, that the more we do it, the better we get at it. And so I find, because I do this a lot, that as soon as I hear the first couple words of this, that I can feel my body starting to relax a bit. So I want to encourage you to actually start practicing some relaxation strategies. And there's really great commercially available products. So you can go into lots of different bookstores and find tapes or books that have relaxation activities through it. Now let's talk about what you can actually do in the test. We'll talk about different strategies for different kinds of tests. Multiple choice exams are probably the most common kind of tests that you'll see in university. So when you have a multiple choice test, with any test, the first thing you want to do is take the test and look it over and just get a sense of the overlay for the test. So, okay, I've just looked it over and I see I've got 40 multiple choice and 5 short answer. So I can kind of decide how much time I need to devote to each section of the test, right? So I'm prepared for that. So now when I start to do the multiple choice, the thing to do is to mark up the test as much as you can. I love when I get tests back from students and there's like writing all over the place or they've highlighted things. So go ahead and make the test yours. So if you read a sentence and you're not sure what it means or you want to make a little note to yourself about it, do that. So read the test question first really carefully. And at that point, I'd encourage you to actually physically put your hand over or just avoid looking at the supplied answers. Because the intent of a multiple choice is that there needs to be some other plausible answers in there, right? So if you're kind of on the fence, you're not really sure, and you start to read the supplied answers, you might get confused by some equally possible answers. So see if you can read the test question and come up with what you know to be the answer before you look at the supplied answers. The next thing you want to do is make sure you've actually read all of the supplied answers. So for example, maybe you read A and A is definitely not right, so read B. Oh yeah, B is right, so off I go. B might be right, but C or D could actually be even better, right? So just make sure you read all of the supplied answers. You also want to watch for, if I use the rest of the sentence that's supplied in the answers, does it fit grammatically with the test question, right? Because sometimes even if instructors are using test banks, or whether they're making up their own tests, they can inadvertently put in a supplied answer that's incorrect, that just doesn't make sense in that sentence, right? So just make sure it actually does really make sense. Now, if you're kind of unsure, immediately eliminate the answers that you know are completely wrong. So maybe you're torn between, let's say, A and C. So just cross off B and D, so you're not even looking at them anymore. And then see how you can eliminate between A and C. When a test has a really long passage, so sometimes instructors might give you like a paragraph or two to read before you start to answer your test questions. Make sure you've really read it and understand that, right, before you go on to it. Okay, now lots of times with multiple choice, you probably have heard that C is usually the best guess. So if you're completely not sure, in the worst case scenario, pick C. Your odds actually are better if you pick B or C. Because what instructors will do is put the right answer amidst wrong answers, right? It's easier to do that. So largely test questions are B or C. So again, this is worst case scenario, you have no idea, you've really tried your best, try to pick B or C. Short answer exams, you want to make sure that short answer, you're really responding concisely. Sometimes students will think, I'm not really sure what the test question's asking, so I'm going to put down everything I know about the topic and hope the instructor finds the right answer in there. You want to make sure that you really craft your answer to be much more concise than that. So even thinking about if your instructor is comfortable with point form, so that you've got your really precise, concise answer. You also want to watch for words in the test question itself, because that can give you a really good tip on how you need to answer the test question. And the same is really true for essay questions. There's really common words that we see in test questions. So things like analyze, describe, explain, compare and contrast. And you want to make sure that you are answering what the test is asking you to answer. So for example, if it says compare and contrast these two theories, or in your earth science class, for example, if it says to compare and contrast these two minerals, to not just explain one and explain the other, but that you actually need to do some comparing and contrasting, right? So make sure you understand what it's asking. Now, it's a really good idea in a test to actually do an outline for an essay question. And there's lots of good reasons to do it, some of which are that if you happen to run out of time, your instructor will see that you had an intent of where you wanted to take the essay, and they might give you some bonus points because they see kind of where you were taking the essay question. It's also really helpful to keep you on track as you're writing, because as you start writing, you might have a flood of ideas and you start writing down some of your thoughts, and as you get the paper developed, you might forget some of the things you originally thought. All right, so think about doing an outline for essay questions. And review it. If you have the time before you hand it in, take time to look over your test. I always cringe when I'm marking tests and I can see a student has missed a page, right? Because as they've been flipping, they might have inadvertently missed a page or missed a question. So just quickly look through and make sure you've answered everything. Now, during the exam, think about doing an information dump. So as soon as you get your test, if you've got some stuff floating around in your brain, you just need to get it out. At the top of the test, just write down all the things you need to remember, right? It might be that you've studied using an acronym, or you made up a silly song and you just kind of need to get it out so you don't forget, right? Do that right away on your test. Again, you want to make sure you take time to survey the exam and make sure that you decide where you should begin, how much time you should devote to each parts of the test. Read the questions really carefully, underline key terms and definitions, and do the easy questions first. So if you're working through it, and let's say you're on question 5 and you get to it and you're kind of really confused about it, not really sure what the answer is, rather than stressing yourself out by staying on that question, circle it or mark it somehow and move on then to the rest of the test and come back to it at the end. And relax, right? Use all these relaxation strategies we've talked about, or other things that you already do that help you to relax. Do them during the test so that your body is really trying to work at relaxing as opposed to getting anxious. And after the exam, do something to reward yourself, because that was a lot of effort. So it might be that you just kind of give yourself a pat on the back, right? Or maybe you do something for yourself that's really special. So I love popcorn. So a treat for me is maybe to pop a bowl and like watch a movie or do something relaxing. Maybe you like to have bubble baths or hang out with friends, right? But really try to plan in some good rewards during your final exam schedule as well, so that you're keeping motivated and doing things to reward yourself.